Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. This is part 2 of our conversation with Ms. Christine An about the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Ms. An is the founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ. She's the co-founder of the Korea Policy Institute, the global campaign to save Jeju Island, and the national campaign to end the Korean War. She's also a columnist with Foreign Policy in Focus. You can follow her work at womencrossdmz.org. You can find her on Facebook under Women Cross DMZ and on Twitter at Women Cross DMZ and at Christine An. That's at Christine AHN. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Korean-Peninsula-2. So why is it that the North Korean regime hasn't collapsed? Because obviously in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we saw communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe collapse. What is it about the North Korean regime that has allowed it to continue to stay in place and to even grow stronger in some ways? Is the oppression worse than we saw from other regimes? Is it these purges that we see in the high levels? Is it something having to do with the Kims themselves? What is it that has allowed for this regime to maintain itself and not collapse?
Well, I think it's probably all of the above. I think that, in the 1990s, North Korea went through a very difficult period known as the Arduous March. So when the Soviet Union disintegrated and basically we saw the end of, the Cold War around the world, many expected North Korea to collapse. And so, there are some people that are very skeptical that say, Clinton signed the agreed framework because there was some expectation that they wouldn't have to deliver because they expected that the North Korean regime would collapse. But, despite up to 2 million people basically perishing in this arduous march, the famine, and that, this has been one area that I have often debated. Some other, North Korea experts, people say, that the famine was caused by the evil dictatorship. And, I often point to this Asia Development Bank report by this woman named Meredith Wu Cummings, who's at the University of Virginia, where she basically, the brilliance of that report was, look, basically we have the same kind of political and economic system. Certainly they have liberalized their economy a little bit more, allowed more markets and, black markets and other activity that, wasn't present in the 80s and to part of the 90s. But, what you have is a regime that has basically practiced the same kinds of control that it did, starting with Kim Il-sung, the founder. And so to say that it's just the regime that's responsible doesn't take into the larger context. And so what was happening was the Soviet Union basically the North Koreans depended very heavily. They also had a friendship deal with China so that they could barter. They were part of this socialist trading bloc. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, so did that economy. And similarly to Cuba, North Korea went into a tailspin, and a lot of its economy, and especially its agriculture, depended on that imported oil, not to just run the tractors, but as they had a very centralized food distribution system. And so they basically had to make some decisions and, decided to keep most of the food distribution within the radius of Pyongyang, which is where the political elite are, and it's the strongest supporters. And so, it basically led to this very difficult situation. And, North Korea came to the international community and basically got on its hands and knees and begged the international community for support. And really, it took almost up to 2 years for the U.S. to send shipments of food and fuel into North Korea. And, that was a very difficult period. I mean, if you see a lot of the defectors, you see a lot of people, that period of the mid 1990s through the mid 2000s is what is the period that you saw a mass defection from North Korea because people were looking to survive. These are just pretty horrific stories about seeing people just dying. And when I went to North Korea for the first time in 2004, I happened to be, in one of these travel, I was on a peace and humanitarian aid delegation, and there was one of my minders was a videographer, and he and I happened to sit way back in the bus together. And I just, brought it up to him casually. I said, so if I could ask, and it's a very sensitive topic for the North Koreans, so I said, what was it like during the arduous march? And I got to tell you, his eyes just kind of went blank. And he said that he was actually tasked to go on behalf of the government to go and document what was happening around the country. And he said it was worse than war in terms of what they experienced. And so, that was a harrowing period for North Korea. And despite all that country went through, it did not collapse, and it still prevailed. And I would say that a large reason for why that is the case is because we are still at war, and because just as we use various apparatuses, North Korea is obviously much more tightly controlled, and they only have one form of media, which is the state media, and they basically have, there's no advertisements. I don't know if either of you have ever been to Cuba, but, I'm sure it's changing now very rapidly, but you don't see advertisements, but what you see instead is political posters all around the country. And, there are tons of posters that remind the people on a daily basis of the brutality that they experienced during the Korean War, in which, at least one in four families lost a family member. The majority of the people that were killed in Korea during the Korean War were people that suffered under the heavy aerial bombing campaigns led by the U.S. I remember reading an I.F. Stone book about the hidden history of the Korean War, which no U.S. publishing house would publish. And I.F. Stone wrote, and he included a Senate testimony from the U.S. air commander at the time. And this was just 1 year into the war. And he said he reported in a Senate testimony, there are no more targets. Basically, everything has been destroyed. You have these stories of North Koreans who built these underground caves and, like little cities because they were trying to withstand the U.S. aerial bombing campaign. And, that's the paranoid mindset. And, that is their lived experience, and combined with the ongoing propaganda that the government perpetuates, which, is in part true. They say, look at what happened to Iraq. Look at what happened to Afghanistan. Look at what happened to Libya. Basically, the U.S. military goes in, they overthrow the will of the people and whoever is elected or put into power, the dictator, and basically obliterates the society. And, they don't have to just have the experiences of those other countries in the Middle East, but they have their own experience of living through the Korean War. And, until we formally resolve this, I don't think that we'll see improvements in North Korea in terms of the civil and political rights of the people. And that's why I often make the case. And, when I was traveling in North Korea with the Chinese American photographer, she said, it's just crazy to me because we were really attacked. Of course, there's an element of misogyny and patriarchy, and what do these women have anything to do with U.S. foreign policy? There will be those attacks, but, we were basically called dupes of the North Korean regime, and we were naive, and, what do we mean by calling for engagement to improve human rights of North Korean people? But she was saying to me, the Chinese woman said, if Nixon had not gone to China in the 70s, I think that China would be very similar to North Korea today. And, even though it's still a very closed political country, I mean, there is far much more free speech and movement and improvements in the day-to-day life of Chinese people. And I say we have to do that for North Korea too. If we really care about the 22 million people in North Korea, why not figure out a different way than being in a constant state of war so that their regime and their dictatorship can basically use the fact that we are still at war to justify the conditions of the people for North Korea.
Well, sure. And I want to turn our attention to the arms race on the Korean Peninsula. And we'll return towards the end of this interview to the subject of ending the Korean War. And we'll delve a little deeper into what you were just saying. But I want to look at the arms race because whenever the topic of North Korea or South Korea, for that matter, or the Korean Peninsula as a whole comes up, the arms race inevitably comes up very quickly. So where did the North Korean nuclear program originate? How did it originate? How has it changed? What does it look like now? And are there any nuclear ambitions from the South Korean government? What have we seen on the South Korean side as relates to nuclear weapons, and what role does the U.S. and potentially other countries play in the arms race on the Korean Peninsula?
It's a really good set of questions. So first of all, most people don't realize this, but, in terms of a nuclear holocaust on the Korean Peninsula, the first threat of that came from the United States. I mean, Wilson, really contemplated using sorry, why do I keep saying Wilson? But the U.S. contemplated using the Korean War, using nuclear weapons during the Korean War. And luckily that did not come to fruition. But after the Korean War ended, the U.S., that was Truman. So the U.S. brought nuclear weapons covertly into South Korea. So up until Bush Sr., the U.S. had nuclear weapons in South Korea. So that obviously was part of the reason why North Korea felt, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed, that they didn't have a kind of nuclear umbrella protection from the Soviets. And so I think that and, basically being in this new world where North Korea was at war with the world superpower that emerged as the victor in the Cold War, the U.S., that they felt that they had to pursue nuclear weapons for self-defense. And whether that's true or not, I mean, that is what the regime is saying. And so they did have a period where they did freeze production after the agreed framework. But once the Bush administration accused North Korea of not upholding its end of the deal and stopped sending shipments of oil, that's when North Korea began its production process. And I think there was another breakthrough in 2005 when Christopher Hill from the Bush administration went and was, through the six-party talks, able to negotiate another freeze. But basically, even within the Bush administration, there was dissension that, didn't want to see this to go through. So I think Chris Hill and Condoleezza Rice were on one side advocating for some kind of diplomatic deal. And on the other hand, I think you had, Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld that didn't want to see that to go through. So anyway, North Korea has obviously been pursuing nuclear weapons, and many experts say that they have up to 10, and that by the end of either a Trump or a Clinton presidency, they could have, up to 100. So, each test that they do, as you may recall, in January, they allegedly conducted a hydrogen bomb test that was, highly questioned by a lot of experts. But, basically they are just, each test that they conduct, they're just advancing their capability. And so in the meantime, the U.S. the Obama administration had this policy called strategic patience, which is basically using the assumption that North Korea is going to collapse, that they're just going to try to squeeze the North Korean regime to collapse. And their primary tool is use of sanctions, and which heavily depend on China's compliance. And as you may know, in July, the U.S. and South Korea made a deal to install the U.S. missile defense system. This is a Lockheed Martin, creation. And, Lockheed Martin is reaping, up to $80 billion in government contracts to build this missile defense system. And, it is causing a huge outcry, not just within the residents of where this THAAD missile defense system will be installed in South Korea, but also outcry from China, which is saying that actually you say it's being used as a defense from a North Korean missile, but, it could be adjusted to essentially have a surveillance range of 620 miles, which means that it would be used also to project power against China and be used against China. And so, it's creating this situation that, in international relations, it's called the security dilemma, as you guys know. But, it's basically one country is viewing, whatever situation. So in the North Korean eyes, they're viewing the U.S. South Korean military exercises, which, have been the largest ever in recent years and in the spring, as an offensive thing. And, even within their operation plans, they included something about beheading, So basically they see that as an exercise in simulating the invasion of North Korea. So North Korea views that as highly provocative and aggressive. And so they're just going to continue their nuclear nuclear capacity, and also, keep advancing their missile capability. And it's just creating this endless situation where each country is viewing, provocations from the other side as justification to further intensify their militarization. There's an article today in the New York Times about the Abe administration. So Japan, which has had this constitution that has been a pro-peace constitution, is basically, rapidly militarizing. And, he submitted a budget that would rapidly increase Japan's military capability, which also includes installing more missile defense systems. And, it's just creating the situation. If we look at the world's 10 biggest defense or military spenders in the world, it's the U.S. is number one, China, Russia, South Korea, and Japan. They're in that top 10 list. And, basically it's a tinderbox. I mean, North Korea may not have the same kind of spending capacity because it's a poor country, but they have nuclear weapons. And, we have to figure out another way than allowing more militarization, because it's not only going to lead to a potential hot war and a World War III that could be devastating for Americans in the United States, but it is, basically diverting a lot of desperately needed resources that we need to rebuild our, dilapidated infrastructure. It's like we have 1 in 4 children go to bed hungry in this country. And as we know, we are in a very tense time with tremendous inequality in this country. And, by allowing this ongoing militarization and arms race to continue, that also means that it will have huge costs on our social well-being.
So I want to get to a topic really quickly, and it's the ability of North and South Koreans to interact with each other. So we just had the Rio Olympics. What was it like for those two teams to interact with each other, and how in general do they interact with each other?
I know. I don't know if you guys remember seeing, it was pretty popular, but it was a selfie that was taken by a South Korean gymnast with a North Korean gymnast. And it was like a really touching moment about why the Olympics are so important. These people cannot see each other, and, they have to be at a place like the Olympics to actually be able to interact. And, as I mentioned, in South Korea, there is a national security law that says that you basically need government approval to interact. And, in North Korea, obviously, anybody that wants to leave the country has to go through, they only obviously allow people that they trust to leave the country. And, we just often look at the brutality and repression in North Korea. But, truth be told, so Women Across DMZ, one thing that we were not able to do last year when we did this peace walk was to bring North and South Korean women together. We wanted to do that at the DMZ, but, we obviously didn't get approval from either side. And so we have been really trying to be a bridge as international women trying to bring North and South Korean women together. And, we tried to do that this spring. We picked a third-party country that both countries or both citizens of North and South Korea felt safe that they could travel to. There's only a handful of countries, mostly in Asia. And so we picked Indonesia and we picked Bali because of, the kind of pro-peace, a little bit hippie-ish, the environment that could be a little more relaxed for the people to come together. And, it wasn't North Korea that ultimately blocked their citizens from going. It was South Korea. And so we have this situation where, repression on both sides of the DMZ is not just quashing the development and the political advancement of free speech and rights within their countries, but you have the situation where this, basically this military border and the state of war is, preventing people from seeing each other. And there's 1.2 million landmines that, is in the way of the Korean people ever being able to see each other. And so, the first step is we have to figure out a way to end the Korean War. And, for Americans, we say, well, that's their problem, but it's not. It's our problem because we are a signatory to that armistice agreement. And we, along with South Korea, are in this state of war with North Korea. And so that's why we feel it's really urgent that we figure out some kind of diplomatic solution to the ongoing conflict. And, I know that we don't have a whole lot of time left, but there was a resolution that was introduced into Congress last year, and it was introduced by 3 members of Congress, and they were all veterans of the Korean War. One is Charles Rangel from New York, John Conyers from Michigan, and the third is Sam Johnson, and he's a Republican. He's from Texas, and these are the veterans. They lived through it. They saw what happened in that atrocious war. And, even they are calling for some kind of way to formally end the Korean War. And so, this may sound pie in the sky, but the good news is there was a good piece in the Korea Times that said that, Seoul, South Korea, has been put on notice that it's time for a different approach. And one that is not about continuing the standoff and more militarization, but that there needs to be some kind of diplomatic solution, that is a message that is coming from Washington, D.C. So, that is very heartening to me, but it just means that, the people of this country, we need to let our members of Congress, let our political leaders know that we need to figure out some way to have a diplomatic breakthrough with North Korea. We did it with Iran. We did it with Cuba. Right now, Colombia and the Philippines, they've negotiated the ceasefire agreements. Peace is possible. And I think that for the advancement of an improvement of our people's lives in this country, we need to do something. Otherwise, we're just going to be in this endless arms race.
What do you think the peace or reunification would look like, and how do you think that would occur, and what do you think the chances are of that happening, as well as what do you think the chances are of the unfortunate situation of a hot war developing?
Well, I mean, I think that, as we saw in the period of 2000. Well, so even if we look back, so, I mean, I'm heartened by a potential Clinton presidency because, yes, I'm a Democrat, but because I think she has some very important historical knowledge of the fact that her husband was this close to signing a non-aggression pact with North Korea, that Madeleine Albright went to North Korea and she said, these are people that we can negotiate with. Sure, it's a different leader, but as I said before, I don't think that their tactics change a whole lot. I mean, certainly they have liberalized their economy a little bit, but it's still the same regime that is in power. And the second is that we have the experience of North and South Koreans through the 2000 June 15 Joint Declaration of beginning that process of reconciliation. And, you know, what kind of future a reunified Korea would look like, I have no idea. But as the two leaders said, let's let the future decide. But first, we have to begin the process of having families reunite and see each other, to have members of civil society reunite and see each other and understand each other, and, you know, some way to integrate the economies. But let's let the future decide. And I think that, you know, even going back to that place with obviously much more open eyes, because we know how the North Korean regime, you know, is very clever, but that, you know, without believing that we can figure out another way, and without opening our hearts to having friendship and not having perpetual enemies, I just don't think that we're going to advance anywhere. And so we are really making a big push so that there can be a peace treaty that replaces the armistice as the political leaders promised. And, you know, we're going to have to push for it. So, you know, we believe that education is, you know, the primary step. And so having this interview with you, I think, really contextualizes the conflict for your listeners.
Well, sure, and thank you very much for joining us today. Obviously, there are a lot of other topics related to this.
Yeah, and Daniel. Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
I talked quite a bit, but hopefully it was informative and your listeners were able to track most of it.
Well, definitely, and thank you so much. And obviously there are a lot of other topics related to these tensions that we did not get to, so hopefully in the future we'll be able to continue this conversation. But in the meantime, if someone wants to learn more about the topics we've been discussing today, what readings or resources do you recommend they take a look at, as well as what are the best ways to follow your work?
Well, they can go to womencrossdmz.org. We have a bunch of articles up there that's published by myself, but many of the other women that are part of Women Cross DMZ. And the Korea Policy Institute is a great resource, kpolicy.org. That's an organization led by a lot of Korean American scholars, a lot of professors that have, you know, dedication to seeing peace on the Korean Peninsula. And another resource is, I think it's ASCK.org, but it's the Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea. And that is, you know, dozens of U.S.-based Korea experts and historians that are trying to push for more engagement and diplomacy with North Korea.
All right. Well, I want to remind everybody to go check out the show notes page for this episode, which can be found at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Korean-Peninsula. And, of course, we will have links to Women Cross DMZ there and womencrossdmz.org and to kpolicy.org and all of the resources that we've mentioned over the course of this interview. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Korean-Peninsula is the place to go for resources related to this episode. That's the show notes page. And I want to encourage everybody, while you're on our website, to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher, as well as to sign up for our email list so you can stay up to date with what's going on with the show and so that you can make sure that you don't miss any episodes. And Christine, as I said earlier, there are so many topics, so many issues we didn't get to. So we would love to continue this conversation with you again. But thank you so much for your time today, for being so generous with your time, and for helping to shed some light on what's been going on in the Korean Peninsula, both over the last several decades and over the last few months, because there are just so many layers to this, so many developments, and it's so important to learn about it. So thank you for helping us.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Look forward to the next time.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.